You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
I herald his beginning.
Marvel Studios' The Fantastic Four.
I herald your end.
The biggest event of the summer.
I herald Galactus.
Has arrived.
What is that? Hold on!
We will fight this together as a family.
Johnny, now!
Marvel Studios' The Fantastic Four First Steps. Only in theaters Friday. Rated PG-13. Some material may not be suitable for children under 13. Get tickets now.
They say to only bring what you can carry. So with the all-new 2025 Ford Expedition Tremor, bring a lot. Like 3 dirt bikes, a few tents, an entire crew ready to make memories. A panoramic 24-inch display, and the confidence to push your limits. The all-new 2025 Ford Expedition Tremor.
Always consult the owner's manual before off-road driving. Know your terrain and trail difficulty and use appropriate safety gear. Max payload varies based on accessories and vehicle configuration. See label on door jamb for carrying capacity of a specific vehicle. Always properly secure cargo.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another History of the Second World War interview. Today, I'm joined for the second time by Jack Bowsher, the author of the upcoming book, or the released book, I guess at this point, Thunder Run, Meiktila, 1945, the greatest combined arms maneuver battle of the Second World War. That's quite a claim, just off the top here.
Yeah, of course. Hi, Wesley. Thank you so much for having me on. You know, we had such a good time last time. But yes, I do genuinely believe this, and hopefully we can get into the exact weeds for why I believe this incredibly bold claim. It is as much about getting conversations started, but hopefully listeners will at least understand why I fronted up such a bold claim at the beginning when they hear it, and especially if they read the book as well. Yeah, thank you.
Your book takes place or covers the time period around the Battle of Meiktila, which takes place in early 1945. To try and help people put that into context, sort of what is the status of the war in Burma at that point in time?
Yeah, of course. And perhaps I can maybe just mention where they are in Europe as well, because obviously for a lot of people, because that will help people place it in the timeline. The Battle of Meiktila is part of it is called the Reconquest of Burma. However, I want to make the argument really that it's a liberation. You know, part of the book, I do talk about the fact that, you know, a lot of the Burmese rose up and actually assisted the British, even though the Burmese in the particular geographical region were originally the ones that most wanted to get the British out of Burma. You know, and they basically switched their opinion after being under the Japanese occupation. They realised that actually Britain was a better hope for their future liberation, which does eventually happen. But of course, it isn't often seen that way. And, you know, American soldiers, even during the war, used to say that SEAC, which is Southeast Asia Command, meant save England's Asian colonies. So, of course, there is slightly tied up in this thing. And that's why the campaign that centres around the Battle at Meiktila and also the Battle at Mandalay, the race to Rangoon that's immediately afterwards, you know, is not really in our sort of consciousness normally. You know, we don't think of this part. We often skip the final bit of the war in Burma to the Japanese surrender and then the atomic bombs. And, you know, places like Iwo Jima, Okinawa are bigger anyway. They're close to the Japanese islands. And so if we're going to place this in the timeline of the Second World War, the famous battles in Burma before this are Imphal and Kohima. Bill Slim and his 14th Army have broken out from that victory and chased the Japanese through the monsoon back into Burma. And then Meiktila is part of this two-pronged attempts to do a feint in one direction and a real move in another direction to trap the Japanese in the central part of Burma, destroy them so they can then capture Rangoon. Now, all of this takes place in sort of like the operation properly begins with the crossing of the Irrawaddy in February 1945. So this is the period when, you know, the Allies in Europe, for example, are coming up to the German border. It's the post-Battle of the Bulge period, and they're sort of shaping operations before crossing the Rhine in March. And that in particular, most of the Battle of Meiktila is from, the main part of it is the 28th of February, when the British and Indian troops arrive at Meiktila, until the Japanese break off, is from the 28th of February up until roughly the 31st of March. You know, different sources will say the battle ends on slightly different days, but it's basically the end of March, that whole sort of 5-week period, give or take. Now, and that's not the only part of the book. That's the main battle at the centre of the book. But that is kind of where we're at. So sort of end of February into March. So maybe the 6 weeks from the middle of February to the end of March. That's the main place it is. And so during the middle of the Battle of Meiktila, the Allies cross the Rhine in Europe. So hopefully that sort of helps people place this in the timeline of the Second World War.
Yeah, and you mentioned like some of the battles that had just occurred in Burma. And am I remembering correctly that like the Battle of Impal, one of the Japanese army's greatest defeats, like largest defeats during the war?
Yeah, it is. Because it's such a large battle, a lot of the fighting that takes place in things like the Pacific campaign on the Pacific Islands, because the islands are relatively small, the numbers involved are smaller. So the Imphal-Kohima battle, which is two separate battles that are very closely entwined and their fates are entwined and so on. What happens there is 53,000 Japanese, so, three divisions worth, give or take, of Japanese are basically destroyed out of a much wider invasion. In the combat arms, so infantry particularly, considering the Imperial Japanese Army is basically a light infantry army, they take as many as 80% casualties, where out of that battle. Normally you'd see between 10% and 30% in an Allied battle normally. Like a bad day would be 30%, especially for the infantry, that in particular. And so the Japanese have this huge attempted invasion of India that is so badly defeated that they then are retreating back towards Burma to try and resettle. But they fight for, and it's quite important really, they do fight for every single inch of ground from Imphal, which is a plain in the mountains, sort of in the foothills of the Himalayas. The Japanese fight every inch of ground down two particular routes. One of them is like a mountainy secondary jungle sort of route, very mountainous winding roads through these mountains called the Chin Hills. And then another one down a thing called the Kabul Valley. And this is by, this is interesting in this East African troops under British commanders coming down the Kabul Valley, which is primary jungle with hills on either side of the valley, but also then a flat, thickly jungled valley as well. And it's real inch by inch stuff. And it takes months, these two parallel advances, taking slightly different routes to get to the Chindwin River, which is the traditional geographical divide between Burma and India. It's not literally where the border is, but it's the most obvious geographical divide. And so they actually take quite a few months there. They get to the Chindwin in about early December. So, the Battle of Imphal breakout begins in sort of August. So it takes them, 3 months to get to the Chindwin, where they then build a Bailey Bridge to cross it, ready for Slim's invasion of the country and to liberate it.
So that kind of brings us up close to the battle that we're talking about here. And so, you've kind of titled the book Thunder Run with that very provocative subtitle. And so could you kind of describe like what the sort of the quick mobile movement that happens that I'm assuming caused you in some part to title the book Thunder Run, and how it kind of played into the overall sort of situation at the front they were fighting at the time?
One of the things that's happened in the first sort of 2 years of the war, so 1942, 3, and 1944, the Allies realised quite quickly that the Japanese weren't going to be able to cope with armour. Basically, they couldn't cope with tanks. And that was really the subject of my first book that I came on last time and talked to you about. And the big thing that they've learned is in Imphal and Kohima in particular, the medium tanks that they've brought up, the M3 medium Lee Grant, depending on the turret, that your listeners will know of as being one that was obsolete in 1942 against German armour. And so they end up being shipped to Burma. And because they're a medium tank, the Japanese really struggle to destroy them with the weapons that they have. And so they become a much bigger part of the Allied arsenal. And Slim, over the sort of the period of August to December of 1944, Slim has re-equipped his army not just with more vehicles, but also they've now got their first Sherman tanks in a particular brigade that he has earmarked for the re-invasion of Burma, the liberation and so on, and the 255th Indian Tank Brigade. And they're going to do the kind of big encirclement battle that they really want to do using the flat central plain of Burma, which, we often think Burma is just, monsoon and jungle, and it's, almost like a Vietnam film, the way they're creeping through the jungle and so on. And actually in the middle of it, there is actually this big, open, almost desert plain. And again, if anyone wants to Google the Burma Central Dry Belt, you will see it is a desert, with small clumps of trees here and there, incredibly arid. And the central plain is cut in two by the Irrawaddy, which, roughly speaking, the Irrawaddy crosses this central dry plain diagonally up the middle. Not perfect diagonal, but roughly. And Slim's whole plan is to use the mobility that his tanks and mechanized infantry, so all arms maneuver battle here, he's going to use that advantage he has over this Japanese army that is mostly light infantry, good artillery, very little mobility, especially as by now, the Allies also have mastery of the air. They have the air supremacy as well over Burma. And he's going to use all of these advantages on this central dry belt to destroy the Japanese army to the west of the Irrawaddy. And this is what's called Operation Capital, which maybe some of the listeners have heard of. This is the plan to invade Burma. The problem that takes place is that because Imphal and Kohima had failed, the commander of that operation had been sacked, and the new commander of the Burma Area Army, which is the name of the army group that the Japanese have in Burma, is a new guy called Hotaru Kimura. Now, he has a very interesting backstory in that he's someone who spent time in Europe and a little bit of time in the States, but Europe in particular. For example, he worked with the Weimar government army, so in the 1920s, so the period when Hitler is being arrested after the Munich Putsch and that sort of thing. Kimura's in Europe with the Germans, learning about the European way of war, but also he goes over to Britain and so on. And he doesn't do what Slim expects. So I said earlier that after Imphal, the Japanese fought tooth and nail for every inch as the Allies pushed them out of Imphal up to the Chindwin. When Slim crosses the Chindwin, he assumes the Japanese will do exactly the same thing again, and Kimura doesn't. To his incredible surprise, knowing what the Japanese are like, and again, a lot of your listeners, I'm sure, will absolutely understand the way that the Japanese dig in their bunkers and so on, like they do on all the islands of the Pacific Campaign in the Philippines and so on. That assumption turns out to be incorrect. Kimura does the incredible thing that he retreats behind the Irrawaddy River, which is completely logical to a Western European commander, but it just doesn't fit the stereotype that the Allies have built up in their minds that the Japanese will fight for every single yard. And so when Operation Capital goes out across this first bit of the plain, Slim doesn't get the big maneuver battle that he wants straight away because Kimura has done the right thing. It's completely logical. He's got this huge river, and to put this in perspective, the Irrawaddy in the dry season is about 3 times as wide as the Rhine. And the romance we have of, going back to Roman times, the great frontier between the Roman Empire and the sort of the barbarian east of Europe and so on. And yet the Irrawaddy is 3 times wider, and Slim does not have the resources that are available for the crossing of the Rhine in Europe. He doesn't have the Buffalo LVTs. He doesn't have LCVPs being carried on the back of lorries to the front on a Western European road network from the port to Antwerp. He's relying on stuff coming over a single lane highway that has been dug in the virgin jungle across 2 mountain ranges that are 4,000 feet high. So Kohima, which was earlier, and then south of Imphal, 2 mountain ranges in both places. And also the Chindwin River, which is a Bailey Bridge, crossing a single Bailey Bridge. And they're making a lot of the boats and rafts out of teak forests themselves, just cutting down the teak forests and making them there and then. And they're using things like sections of Bailey Bridges on pontoons and like canvas collapsible boats to cross. If any of your listeners have seen the film A Bridge Too Far, when they're crossing the Vaal, Robert Redford's looking really handsome, crossing the river. Think of those boats, and they're crossing a river 3 times as wide, opposed as well. It's the widest opposed river crossing undertaken in the Second World War. And whilst the beginning of the crossing is really, really difficult, it nearly goes wrong. Soon, a mixture of sort of firepower and just perseverance means they force a crossing, and they get across in multiple places. This is where Slim's plan, after the first part had failed, so remember, he initially wanted to destroy the Japanese on the west side of the Irrawaddy in the northern part of the dry plain. But because Kimura's retreated and he's having to bounce this crossing, Slim has decided to do a big feint. The obvious place to attack in the central plain of Burma is the city of Mandalay. So again, I'm sure lots of listeners will have heard of it. It's one of the most famous cities in Burma, Rangoon, now Yangon, but Mandalay is still Mandalay. The Japanese sort of assume that that's the obvious target. It's former capital, Rudyard Kipling had written about it. If British soldiers knew the name of a place, they probably did know Mandalay. They might have known Rangoon. They probably didn't know anywhere else. And so Slim intends to make it look like he's doing the same operation he always intended. So that first step over the Chindu and into the northern part of the Central Plain, heading straight for Mandalay, he makes it look like that's still his intention. In the meantime, he secretly sends one of his corps down another valley, the Gangor Valley, which is to the west. Because it's in another one of these jungle valleys, the Japanese haven't got lots of troops there. And he uses locally raised Indian hill tribe troops. So I say that they're Indian hill tribes, but they ethnically will look more like they're Burmese because they're in that borderland between the two. And so they do the fighting on sort of at the tip of the spear. But in reality, there's an entire corps behind them secretly going down this valley. And they use these locally raised Indian troops to do the fighting so the Japanese don't realise there's an entire corps behind them. And there's a couple of sort of hairy moments, where they kind of, it's taking a bit too long and all this stuff for them to make the timeline. But eventually they're ready to cross the Irrawaddy about 80, 90 miles south of Mandalay. But remember, Slim is having all of his other divisions, another whole corps attacking Mandalay. And that's the feint that he's really trying to pull off here. The Japanese are going to send all of their reinforcements to Mandalay. And then because Slim doesn't want Kimura to retreat again, say into the jungles of southern Burma, which would be a really, really hard fight. Again, remember, his key objective is to use his tanks, his mobility to destroy the Japanese where they are on the central dry plain where these kind of vehicles work best. This feint is designed to send all of the Japanese reinforcements to Mandalay and then use this secret thrust 80 miles to the south to shut them up in the north of Burma and destroy them where they are, so that once they've destroyed them, they can get to the port at Rangoon before the monsoon happens, and therefore they don't need to worry about that really long, tenuous supply line back over the two mountain ranges and all this sort of stuff. And that's the beauty of the operation. Once he's got across the Irrawaddy and traps the Japanese to the north, the armour will then come into its own, and that mobility will come into its own.
So now that we've set up this really quick movement, we've set up what it's trying to accomplish, how does it go?
So yeah, this is the famous Thunder Run. And it is quite important to say, I'm putting the name Thunder Run on it. No one at the time called it that. And this goes back to when I did my master's a few years ago, because sort of three things happened. I was preparing my reading for a dissertation into tanks in Burma that became the first book, Forgotten Armour. But at the same time, in the day-to-day study that we were doing as part of the course, we'd just done the 1991 Gulf War, and we were doing the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the Thunder Run to Baghdad. And it had just so happened that whilst we were studying that, Putin also started his invasion of Ukraine, and in particular the thrust south from Belarus. And, your listeners might remember on the news the long tailbacks of the Russian supply vehicles all being destroyed by missiles and drones and so on. And Putin's his own version of a Thunder Run failed to capture Kyiv, and they had to turn back and they retreated into Belarus. So all those three things are happening. I'm reading about tanks in Burma, Putin invades Ukraine, and I'm studying the 2003 invasion of Iraq. And so the Thunder Run became the obvious thing because I could see what Putin did wrong, what America did right in 2003, and also what Slim did right in 1945. And it's the same thing that America does in 2003, the Russians tried to do but failed. And the big thing that failed the Russians was they tried to have a land supply route back to friendly territory. Whereas in the 2003 invasion of Iraq, for the initial thrust, they relied on aerial resupply by helicopters. What happens on the Thunder Run, my Thunder Run to Meiktila in 1945, is the whole point of this operation is, like we said earlier, they want to trap the Japanese north at Mandalay and destroy them. The town of Meiktila is the perfect place because all of the Japanese supplies that come into Burma, so through the port of Rangoon, from the railway that was built by the POWs in the Far East, people have seen the bridge on the River Kwai. That road and the one from Rangoon, they all go to Meiktila, and then they go back out across Burma to resupply Japanese soldiers at the front. By attacking and capturing Meiktila, you're both trapping the Japanese in the north, and you're capturing their supply hub. So the Japanese will have to take it back and counterattack Meiktila. So Slim's plan is therefore, that's how he's going to destroy the Japanese. The Battle at Mandalay, Battle of Meiktila, which my book focuses on Meiktila in particular, they're going to capture that place. The Japanese will come to them and be destroyed because it's that central dry plain tanks and so on. So on the 14th of February, after the Irrawaddy is crossed, over the next week or so, the 255th Indian Tank Brigade and the 17th Indian Division gather on the east side of the Irrawaddy, ready to break out in the Thunder Run. And on the 21st of February, that's exactly what they do. So we're talking 3,000 vehicles, at this stage about 15,000 men, because it's not the entire division, it's 2 brigades, which in the American system would be 2 regiments of infantry. So it's a weak division, and also the tank brigade has only got 2 of its 3 tank regiments as well. So they're slightly weakened units, for good reasons, we're about to say, but they strike out across the central dry belt, moving at speed. Pace is the key here. And the thing that makes it work, like what worked in 2003 in Iraq, what didn't work for Putin in 2022, was there is no supply chain back to the Irrawaddy. These 3,000 vehicles, these 15,000 or so men, they will be entirely supplied by parachute drops, and eventually, when they capture them, a local airfield at the town of Meiktila. And so they're driving across, and you get all these amazing quotes from these guys. A lot of the British soldiers are kind of a bit like the stereotype of the cavalry officer now in a tank that you imagine. And they talk about, it's just like a fox hunt. So it's just like going on a point to point in the estate back home. It's fantastic, and they genuinely are having the time of their life, and which is really interesting because the Japanese are a really, really vicious foe. But these tank men haven't faced them yet because, listeners remember, Slim had earmarked them for this job. So they haven't fought the Japanese yet. They're green. The tank men are green troops. The infantry are a bit different. The 17th Indian Division that are doing this have been selected because they're very experienced. They've been fighting the Japanese since January 1942. They were rushed to face the Japanese when they invaded in the very beginning of January. They were badly prepared, badly trained, because they had only a short amount of training, and that training was to go and fight the Germans in North Africa in the desert, not to fight the Japanese in the jungles of southern Burma. So 17th Indian Division have a really horrific time in 1942. Half of them or more than half of them are on the wrong side of a bridge when it gets blown up, and then they have to rebuild themselves. But they fight through the rest of the campaign up to 1945, really, really exemplary after being rebuilt. And so Slim relies on them. They are aggressive, they are confident because they've already beaten the Japanese. So he has this experienced infantry division and this green, but very well equipped and very well trained tank brigade going with them. And they are charging across this desert and striking the Japanese before they're organised. So this is the beginning of this combined arms manoeuvre battle, because including with the mechanised infantry and the tanks are Priest self-propelled guns, the 105mm howitzers on the Sherman chassis, and also what's called visual control posts, which is basically an airman in a jeep with a radio calling down things like, in particular, USAF P-47 Thunderbolts to do ground attack tasks as well. And they strike across this thing. It's about 80 miles to Meiktila from the Irrawaddy. So they take about a week to do it. And they have a particularly bitter clash at a village called Oyin, where they first come face to face with an organised Japanese defence, bunkers and built in the basements of the sort of the wooden buildings or in pits underneath the wooden bashers and so on. And they get attacked by, the infantry equivalent of a kamikaze pilot. So they have Japanese soldiers charging out from, the side of the building, holding a box of what's called picric acid. It's something that's used in explosives, and jumping under the Sherman tanks to blow them up from underneath and that sort of thing. Really, really quite grim stuff. But they do manage to defeat the Japanese, lots of bunker busting between the infantry and tanks. And then they carry on. And by the 28th of February, they're on the hill overlooking Meiktila, which is sort of nestled in between 2 different lakes. And they sort of prepare themselves for a street battle in this sort of transport hub.
It's back to school season, and Clorox is donating 2 million disinfecting wipes to classrooms across America. Because back to school means things can get a little bit messy. Just ask second grade teacher Mr. Torres.
Put me and just one Clorox wipe on a team? We can take on crayon smudges, sticky fingerprints on every surface, sneezes on the door handle, juice box explosion by the sink, snack crumbs, and don't even get me started on the bathroom passes.
Clorox disinfecting wipes. Teacher's #1 wipe.
Think about it. Bathroom passes.
Clean feels good. based on unit sales data.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. Between two-factor authentication, strong passwords, and a VPN, you try to be in control of how your info is protected. But many other places also have it, and they might not be as careful. That's why LifeLock monitors hundreds of millions of data points a second for threats. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast for 40% off. Terms apply.
Thinking about Meiktila as an urban center, right? You kind of use the word urban center or urban landscape in your book. Earlier you mentioned that a lot of people, when they picture fighting in Burma, they think like the densest jungle in the world, and that's not always the case. So could you talk just a little bit about what the urban geography of this city was? Because they're going to fight into the city, then the Japanese are going to counterattack. And so there's a lot of action happening in these areas. And so what kind of is the urban geography, and how does it differ from maybe what people's mental pictures might be, which is like, I don't know, wooden shacks on a hill in a jungle?
Yeah, exactly. So the key thing to remember is this is the middle of the dry belt. So when the periphery of the town is very, very flat, sort of light reddy brown, dusty ground, with clumps of trees here and there. Tamarind trees were often used for shade in the villages. But when you come to Meiktila, we've said this, it's a transport hub. It has a railway running through it. It has a railway marshalling yard. It has warehouses for the trade that would be transporting up and down the country. And the roads as well, the main roads that come in and then fan back out in sort of every sort of point of the compass. There's roads going in every direction. So it's got modern, European colonial city architecture in the centre because it's built up around the railway that was brought by the Europeans, essentially. Now, the periphery of the village the periphery of the town does have those wooden bashers, the soldiers called them, the wooden shacks and so on, and the trees that are sort of giving shades to the locals during the day and so on. Because it's, when this battle takes place, we're talking 40-degree heat every day, very little water, which becomes a problem. But it's concrete and brick buildings. There are industrial buildings. There are things like maintenance centres for the Japanese military. There's a large hospital. There's a large jail. And all of these get turned into like Japanese centres of resistance. The railway station itself is kind of like the centre of the entire town and is the centre of the Japanese defence. But there are also points of high ground. And there's the traditional Japanese, Burmese pagodas as well. So it's a Buddhist part of Burma, a lot of it anyway. And so you have these Buddhist monasteries with their huge pagodas, and some of them are like bright white, others are golden. There's one of the guys that I quote in the book, he talks about when, they're shooting up one of these things, and he remembers it was late in the afternoon, sort of sunset, and the way that the gold paint as the pagoda shattered, the way that it dropped, and all the gold fluttered down, glittering in the sunlight. He couldn't help how beautiful it was as they're shooting it up to destroy the Japanese that are using it as a machine gun position. So it's this amazing sort of mix. But the main thing is it is a European-style grid street system because that's kind of part of the Japanese defence. They are able to very easily canalise, sending the British and Indian forces down certain routes that they then ambush on. And they're dragging things like anti-tank guns into some of the buildings. Soldiers, when they're fighting street to street, and it is street to street, room to room. I mean, I'm not going to literally compare it to Stalingrad because obviously completely different type of battle, but the room to room, hand to hand fighting, I mean, that's kind of more what I'm thinking here, nothing to do with the weather or anything. The room to room grim reality of it. And the Japanese are using things like the basements that the Europeans have built into the ground, often for storing things in a cooler environment because it's so hot. This is an age before air conditioning, for example. And so the Japanese have turned almost all of the basements into bunkers. And all these things need to be cleared. And the brick dust gets everywhere. Soldiers talk about how they're getting it in their nose and in their throats and things like that. It's a really, really surprisingly grim environment because it's 40 degrees, brick dust, concrete dust, urban fighting, room to room. And again, you've got the added thing of, and again, lots of listeners will know this from the Pacific campaign, just how hard the Japanese fight, especially when they're surrounded. And this is the key thing, is that this fighting takes place when the British and Indian troops surround Meiktila and then enter it from about 3 different sides, because I mentioned earlier, it's nestled between some lakes, so there's only really 3 routes into the town because the fourth side of it's sort of shielded by lake. And yeah, it's pretty grim stuff. A couple of Victoria Crosses are won in the fighting. Which in a victorious battle, that's unusual. D-Day, which is a much, much bigger operation, there's only 1 Victoria Cross on D-Day. Whereas the Battle of Meiktila, there's 2, which I find fascinating as just a quirk, not less. I don't think there's a deeper meaning to it. I just think it's an interesting fact.
That's a pub quiz type of fact there, that file that away. It could win you something sometime. You did mention kind of the Japanese troops, right? And we haven't talked much about the Japanese forces in this area. With it being so far behind the front and kind of a logistical hub, not necessarily a front line area, like what kind of troops are we talking about here? Like, are these just like supply troops that get kind of pressed into defending the city?
Yeah, there's an interesting mix, really. There are a lot of supply troops, probably as much as I probably need to double check my maths on this because I have detailed it. I'm very lucky. One of the things that I discovered doing the research for this was the Japanese commander of the logistic hub. So he's not a combat commander, Major General Kasuya. He is a logistician by his complete trade. He was captured after the war, and he gave a day-by-day account of this battle, the strengths and all sorts. So I was able to go into an unbelievable amount of detail of the numbers, like the exact numbers of the defence. And off the top of my head, about a third of them are all logistics troops. But there are some proper infantry that are brought in once the Japanese realise how serious the threat is. Because remember, they all think Mandalay is the real target. And they do realise before it's completely late, but probably too late to stop the Thunder Run. But they do manage to get some frontline infantry, relatively fresh frontline infantry into the city or town before it's surrounded. And also then there is a hospital that has recuperating soldiers. Many of those are pressed into service, and even the ones that can't really leave the hospital are given weapons and told to fight from their bed, out the windows, but also if anyone comes in, which again, a Gurkha unit has the pretty grim task of clearing that during the battle. Going, it's like a horror movie going room to room in a hospital, because it's that environment where, it's almost like a horror film being in a hospital and fighting. It's so incongruous, it feels weird. What happens there is you have this strange mix, but the Japanese idea of Bushido means that it kind of doesn't matter if they're frontline soldiers or not. It's going to be grim regardless. And fighting defensive battles is easier than, say, the kind of Japanese manoeuvres they were doing in 1942 or when they invaded the Philippines or Malaya or whatever. These aren't complicated operations for defenders to carry out, but they are fighting a losing battle. They are outnumbered about at least 10 to 1, or possibly even 20 to 1. Again, it's all about estimates here is part of the problem, because there are blatantly going to be some undocumented people in the unit. So as good as Kasuya can be, he can be woolly in other ways in his sort of recollections. Often various people, including the official history, put the estimate between 2,000 and 3,000 defenders. They're being attacked by by the time the British actually get there, they brought in reinforcements by plane, so they're even bigger than they were when they first set out. And they crushed the Japanese in about 4 days. And it's really it's after those first 4 days that the really serious battle happens. And apart from the Thunder Run, this is also where the combined arms manoeuvre battle thing comes back in, because there is a really, really clever plan of defence. Because Meiktila is a relatively big place. I mean, compared to a European town or city, it's not that big. But for Burma, it's big. And for the number of troops that have been sent there, it's a large place. And so the commander of the 17th Indian Division, who's effectively this operation is on a ground level, he doesn't have enough men to have a proper perimeter around the whole of the town and also the airfield that is going to be where all the supplies are brought in. Because, the reason why the Thunder Run works so well is because it's being supplied entirely by air. It's not got a tail going all the way back to the Irrawaddy and friendly troops. So once they've captured Meiktila, they are effectively surrounded again, 80 miles behind Japanese lines. But that's always been the plan from the start. Okay, they've captured that important supply hub, so they might be surrounded, but because they've got control of the air, Slim is confident he can resupply them. And why is he confident? Well, he was able to have the Battle of Imphal, where they were completely surrounded by the Japanese, the smaller Battle of Kohima, where they were completely surrounded by the Japanese, happening at the same time. And he could keep all of those divisions, about 5 of them in the end, supplied entirely by air. He knows he can do this. And so they decide, well, we'll do this in an offensive way. Because it's the Central Dry Belt, we're going to use our tanks in a very, very clever way.
I'm assuming because they are prepared for a Japanese counterattack. They are, as you've mentioned, they are setting on a very important piece of real estate that I'm assuming the Japanese try to get back.
Yeah, and that's completely part of the plan. They want the Japanese to come to them to be destroyed. Again, I don't know how well some of your listeners will know Napoleonic history. I teach a little bit in Napoleonic history, and a big thing with Admiral Nelson, who wins the Battle of Trafalgar, is he always wants to annihilate the French. Annihilate. Slim uses that in this particular battle, and the entirety of the reinvasion of Burma really is about annihilating the Japanese, rather than fighting them in places where the geography will suit them. Hence why he's taken this piece of prime real estate. The Japanese have to capture it back because it's that supply hub and all this sort of thing. And so this is where the beauty of how he's going to use these tanks in that combined arms manoeuvre battle. I've said already, he can't keep that continuous perimeter Cowan, the on-the-ground commander, who's in the town. So he sets up a series of defensive boxes, like he did in Far, Kohima, the admin box and so on. And then every single day, as the Japanese bring reinforcements to attack, he will send sweeps of mechanized infantry, tanks, self-propelled artillery, and those visual control post jeeps that call in air strikes. They just go out as much as 20 miles away for 2 or 3 days at a time, and they just go around marauding through this plain, destroying the Japanese before they're organised. So bear in mind, they're surrounded in enemy territory and behind the Japanese lines by 80 miles, being supplied by air. They keep the initiative because as many as 6 of these sweeps go out, and what they're doing is they're using things like aerial reconnaissance, armoured car patrols, and in particular, locals coming in and telling them where the Japanese are and what route they're taking. And so the British are effectively using their tanks, self-propelled artillery, mechanised infantry, and airstrikes to then smash the Japanese whilst they're still organising, 10, 15, 20 miles outside the town, rather than fighting a defensive street-by-street battle, which to a degree would actually suit the Japanese. They want an up-close personal light infantry battle. They don't have the anti-tank weapons or doctrine to stop these sweeps. So one of the things that keeps happening is the Japanese will, and again for the audio, I'm doing like inverted comma quote, the air quote thing. The Japanese, air quotes, capture a village outside Meiktila that they think, yeah, great, we've taken this village on the hill overlooking Meiktila, we're doing great here. And then the next morning, a squadron of tanks, a battalion of infantry and a battery of self-propelled artillery come in, plaster them, destroy a couple of their anti-tank and artillery guns, kill 100, maybe 200 Japanese infantry, and the Japanese have lost, air quotes, the village. But then the British immediately pull out. The British plan is not to capture territory for the sake of it. It's to kill the Japanese. It's like body count in Vietnam. It's not the Japanese and the British are not fighting the same battle. And so the Japanese think they capture places, but they're kicked out of it a day later, but then they can recapture it. And then they're kicked out of it a day later. And this repeats in multiple different directions, multiple different villages every day for 4 weeks. And the Japanese are completely battered by it. The difference is in the second half of March, the Japanese bring in a new commander who slightly changes the game for the right reasons. And it's the second half of March where the battle is at its greatest drama, really.
Up until that point, it really sounds like a great example of just an incredibly active defense, right? Of using your strengths against the enemy and, the excellent reconnaissance information provided by the old farmer from over the hill.
Yeah, exactly right. And what happens is the Japanese now realise that they've been doing all these attacks, capturing these little villages, but never really bringing their forces together in a Clausewitzian strike against the British and Indian defenders. And I should repeat this really, or say this. This is predominantly an Indian soldier operation. You're talking at least 2/3 of the troops are Indian and Gurkha, and the rest are British. So it's predominantly an Indian army thing. What happens is that the Japanese realise that all of this operation is being completely fed by air. They've seen all of the Dakotas coming in all the daylight hours, bringing in supplies. They're also carrying wounded out, which is quite important. New British units and Indian units are brought in. Another brigade of another sort of 3,000 troops is flown in during the battle as well. And what basically happens is the the Japanese commander Honda, who had been fighting American and Chinese troops up in the Hukong Valley, the Michinara and so on, he's brought south because he's such a capable commander. And the battle at Meiktila is clearly the decisive one of the campaign. He comes south and he's like, we need to concentrate just on the airfield. Stop with this, let's occupy territory all around it and crush it from multiple sides. Forget that. Close the airfield. They will starve. They will either have to go back from where they came from, okay, we can destroy them on the road and ambushes and all this sort of thing, or at the very least, they will just starve where they are and surrender. Whatever. The airfield is clearly the key to this. So the final 2 weeks of March, the Japanese put all of their effort on there. And one of the things I've not mentioned here, but it is important, and it shows you just how important this operation was to the Japanese. Basically, all of the Japanese 15th armies, now an army in the Japanese Burma area army is actually like a corps in the British and American armies at the time. So the 15th Army give all of their artillery, basically all of it, to this operation. So when the Japanese send a couple of divisions, they are also coming with an army worth of, like the organisational level of an army's worth of artillery, including like 150 millimeter siege guns and things like that. And so they've been kind of generally plastering Meiktila through this battle. And they're very mobile. The British struggle to tie them down in these armoured sweeps. They might destroy a couple of guns here, a couple there, but the Japanese are very good at moving them when they need to. And so what happens is they all concentrate on the airfield. And now you get things like, as planes are taking off, they're hit by artillery and, the men having to be evacuated from them. There's I recount in the book, I talk about the Victoria Crosses earlier in the battle and what happened on those days, but also there's a military medal, which is lower than a Victoria Cross, but still quite a high one for bravery. A medical orderly dragging wounded men off of a Dakota that's been hit by artillery as it's about to take off and dragging all the wounded back off it before, he's under machine gun and artillery fire whilst he's doing it, raking the Dakota, the C-47, sorry. And so they keep having to do this thing where they're not just under artillery fire in the airfield, but the Japanese are also sending infantry at night to dig in on the airfield. So what happens is every single morning, the British have to send out patrols to clear the Japanese from the airfield before the planes can actually come into land. So this obviously closes the airfield, sometimes for days at a time. Others, it might only be a few hours, and by lunchtime, there are Dakotas landing again. But it causes real headaches. This is the point where they do cut rations for a short while. Wounded begin to pile up at the side of the airfield in the sort of the regimental aid posts and dressing stations and so on. And they're having to push the Japanese off. And eventually the Japanese take so much attrition that they do eventually break off at the end of March. They're exhausted, and two divisions have been, and most of that artillery has been chewed up. Because whilst this fighting around the airfield is going on and is the focus, the armoured sweeps are still going out as well as this battle over the airfield. I call it the duel over the airfield between the British commander Cowan and Honda himself. And so the battle still rages elsewhere. It's just that the focus is on the airfield. But eventually it comes good. The Japanese break off.
So once that kind of happens, this entire adventure was done specifically to isolate the troops to the north, right?
Yeah.
So is the situation for those troops deteriorating? Like, by the end of March, are we close to the point where this kind of changes this area of Burma and the Japanese have to retreat or surrender or do something different?
The thing that's been happening at the same time as this, the battle at Mandalay that started as a feint, has actually been a battle. So the Japanese have been fighting in both these places at the same time, and they've been destroyed there as well. And they sort of the 20th of March, 21st of March, the British and Indian troops at Mandalay are now coming south and they're trapping the Japanese between Meiktila and Mandalay. Slim uses his favourite metaphor that he uses about 3 times in his book, Defeat into Victory, that he's using the troops up at Mandalay coming south of the hammer, and Meiktila is the anvil, and he's hammering them between the two. And that's what takes place sort of in the final week of March. The Japanese are now being crushed. And as the Japanese break off, they're going east out of the place because they're being crushed from north to south. So they get pushed out east. But they are broken as a force. The Burma Area Army is actually genuinely broken at this point. And so the way is open for Slim now to get to Rangoon.
So now that the situation in central Burma, like the Japanese forces there have close to disintegrated, I guess would be a word that I would use, and the way's open to Rangoon, kind of, your book doesn't necessarily cover the rest of the war in this theater, but kind of what is the basic outline of what happens after this? right? And I think that one of the things you bring up, I think in the introduction to your book or somewhere in it, was this idea that when the commanders are making decisions in this theater, much like in many other theaters of the war, like they don't know that there's going to be 2 atomic bombs dropped on Japan in 1945, right? So they have looks like a whole war in front of them still to kind of get the Japanese out of these areas. So kind of what happens with the road open to Rangoon and then looking forward into the future.
The big thing about Rangoon is they're desperate to capture it because, Rangoon is 800 miles, 900 miles from Imphal. So they've come, from Meiktila, it's about 300 miles down to Rangoon, not an inconsiderable distance. And so therefore they're already 500 miles from Imphal and so on, and all the mountain ranges, all those geographical challenges that I've mentioned. And so if they're going to rely on that route for resupply during the monsoon, I mean, that's just not practical. The monsoon will destroy the roads through those jungles that they came down out of Imphal into Burma, and then also across the dry belt. Whilst they would be able to drive across there, they're not going to be able to fly the planes as much in the monsoon, so they're going to be cut off from their aerial resupply as well. And so capturing Rangoon before the next monsoon begins, and so the Meiktila battle finishes in the end of March, they have about 6 weeks. Middle of May is normally when the monsoon starts. So they have to get to Rangoon by that, roughly when the monsoon starts, so that they can resupply by the port at Rangoon, where the monsoon doesn't matter. You can still resupply from there, which means also defeating Japanese. The whole operation in central Burma at Meiktila was designed to open the road to Rangoon for this very reason. Southern Burma is thickly jungled. It's exactly the place in the beginning of the war where the Japanese used that thick jungle to encircle British troops and often destroy them or force them to retreat through ambushes, taking casualties and so on. And so destroying the Japanese there and stopping them getting to southern Burma is why it was so important. So what happens now is they strike out into southern Burma, re-entering the thick jungles that is the stereotype. But now that the Japanese are broken, you get things like tank units with infantry on the engine decks behind them, charging through the jungle and then coming across the Japanese retreating, who don't even fight. They don't surrender, but they don't fight, and they overtake them. And they're left for units coming behind to mop them up. Or they're captured later, or they slip into the jungle. All they really want is to get back to Thailand, really. And a big thing that happens here, and I talk about this briefly in the book as well, is it's not just about these guys. It's the use of locally raised resistance now by SOE, a group called Force 136. And they've taken the hill tribe Burmese. So they're people like the Karen, the Kachin people. So they're Burmese nationality, but ethnically they're different from the Burmas, that the name of the country back then came from. They are ethnically different. And they are generally Christian because of Baptist missionaries in the mountains that converted them, a lot of them American actually, in the Victorian period, and have stayed loyal to the British throughout the war. They now strike out of the jungles as the Japanese are retreating in front of the British striking for Rangoon and are attacking them en masse. As many as 10,000 Japanese are killed by these resistance groups. They're far more effective than anything that happens in Europe. And they have such a tiny life as well. They only operate in these final few months, but they completely outweigh the size of the units. We're only talking a few thousand men, most of them local Burmese hill tribesmen with British trainers and things like that, and British like SOE officers who have been parachuted in. A lot of them had actually fought in Europe with the resistance group, the Jedburgh teams that fought in Europe, have come across to Burma and done all of this in a thing called Operation Character, which is one of the least known operations, but it's a massive impact for such a small force, so sort of cheap in inverted commas again for them to have carried out. And it works so well because the Japanese are broken, but you need to completely grind them to nothing to get to Rangoon before the monsoon. And it's really that operation that allows the armoured forces to push on so strongly, because they don't have to worry about their flanks, because their flanks are now crawling with marauding friendly resistors, dealing with a lot of the Japanese who could have made an organised fight, but they struggle to settle anywhere because they're under this constant pressure. And eventually they get to Rangoon. They get about 50 miles from Rangoon. And, I mentioned earlier the 17th Indian Division. They've been fighting since January 1942. They're a proper phoenix from the flames unit, like I said, they got almost wiped out in 1942 and were rebuilt. And, they've now spearheaded the reinvasion and they've pushed on to Rangoon with the tanks of the 255th. And what they do is when they get 50 miles from Rangoon at a place called Pegu, the heavens open and the monsoon begins. Now, this had been seen. There's normally a week or so of lighter rains that precede the big monsoon. And so what happened is that an amphibious invasion of Rangoon, so coming in up the Irrawaddy Delta into Rangoon directly, near enough, that is now set into motion because up until this point, there hasn't been the shipping. The European theatre was hoovering up as much of the naval assets as was the Pacific, which is a priority because it's a more direct route to Japan. It's worth saying, the Burma campaign really is just about keeping China in the war so that all those 1.5 million Japanese soldiers don't end up in the islands of the Pacific and the Philippines, actually stopping, actually maybe having a much more decisive impact on the war, whereas actually in China, they're just held down doing nothing of great consequence apart from doing nothing of use elsewhere. The Burma campaign is about keeping the Chinese in. And so this amphibious operation to capture Rangoon finally comes in and basically is the coup de grace of the decisive phase of the Burma campaign, because now the capital of Rangoon is lost and the Japanese actually realise what's going on. With the British and Indian forces coming south only 50 miles away, they've actually abandoned it and gone east towards Thailand. And so the amphibious operation to capture Rangoon is almost bloodless. There's a few skirmishes, but it's virtually bloodless. In fact, there's a really famous story where a British Mosquito flies over, the Wooden Wonder, the aircraft, flies over and he sees that Rangoon jail, which is a pretty horrific place, about 40% of all of the people there died under the cruelty of the Japanese as POWs. And on the roof, the prisoners have basically managed to get themselves out because the Japanese have left. And they've gone onto the roof and they've painted on the roofs. And, your listeners can Google this. You can actually see aerial photographs of this. They've written, "Japs gone, extract digit." Now, in English slang, British slang, extract digit means pull your finger out your arse and get a move on. So they've written, "Japs gone, extract digit," as in pull your finger out of your behind and get on with it and rescue us. Because they're all starving. They are starving because, we know what the Japanese do to their prisoners of war. They mistreat them and so on. And so he actually, he lands at the airfield just north, which he doesn't know if the Japanese are there or not, and there isn't. He basically finds a vehicle, drives into Rangoon, finds out they're gone, and then he carries on driving. He manages to find a radio somewhere. I don't know the details. I might have met with there's a Gurkha parachute infantry brigade that has landed, and I think he gets in contact with them. And so then what they do is all the ships that are arriving and unloading troops, they all get back on the ships and then sail up into Rangoon harbour and offload at the harbour itself. And that's sort of the end of the decisive phase. There is actually still fighting in Burma going on till September. So after the Japanese have surrendered. This starts before that, so let me go back. There are still troops trapped in Burma once Rangoon falls. So through the monsoon, all of these troops, tens of thousands of them, logistics and frontline troops, they're trying to get out west to east across Burma, but obviously through the now British lines that have come south and have trapped them in that side of Burma as well. And again, there are some real bloodbath battles in this point, and some of it is this SOE Force 136 group, Operation Character, but also things like tanks and infantry going out again and striking the Japanese as they're trying to withdraw back to Thailand. And this continues into September, so there is still there are still combat casualties amongst the Allies going into September of 1945, fighting the Japanese who are doing the classic Japanese holdout thing. They're just not accepting that the war is actually over, and they think if we can get back to safety in Thailand, the war will carry on. Obviously, they're wrong, but that's why there's fighting as late as September. And that's effectively the end of it. But it is really important. You started me off here about the issue of the atomic bombs. Obviously, they're now preparing for the next phase of the war. Like you say, no one knows that the atomic bomb's coming. And so things like, Cowan, who was the guy that controlled the Meiktila battle, he's promoted. I found an amazing document, actually, which was basically like his army version of a yearly school report. in the British Library, and it had every year going back to the First World War, basically his annual appraisal, and you can see the whole development of his career. It's an amazing thing all the way through the 20s and 30s. It's a file like an inch thick and just of these 2 A4 sheets of appraisal. And at the end of 1945, before they've got to Rangoon, Slim does his appraisal. It's the maddest thing. Like, you don't ever think of this. Whilst Cowan is commanding a division fighting south towards Rangoon, still fighting the Japanese, although they are broken, Slim has time as 14th Army commander to do his appraisal. And it's not a very long one, and it says that it's done in the field, in the documents, in the field, being in the field of battle is the sort of the phrase you see it in war diaries and so on. And what he does is he says on there, I recommend him for Corps Command, so promotion from division to Corps Command. Cowan is now flown out, and he's preparing to be the Commonwealth Corps that will invade mainland Japan with the Americans, because there was going to be a Commonwealth Corps. So there were going to be British, Indian, Australian troops joining with America. Obviously, America was going to be like 90% of the invasion of Japan. I'm not claiming some kind of credit. But the Commonwealth were going to have representation, if you see what I mean, in the way that, say, perhaps a good example would be the way that the Free French are involved in D-Day. The Commonwealth were going to provide a corps to invade Japanese home islands. And Cowan was going to command it, the guy that had masterminded the battle at Meiktila, the armoured sweeps across the Central Plain and all these sorts of things. And other units in Burma were even getting to the point where they were beginning to gather outside Rangoon to then also go and invade Malaya in a sooner operation. That was going to be sooner than the invasion of Japan. That was assumed to be 1940 or like the middle of 1946. Whereas Malaya was going to be earlier in 1946. So some of the troops in Burma were being readied for that operation. They finally get DD tanks. They begin to arrive ready for that operation in Malaya and that sort of thing, ready for that next phase. But obviously, the atomic bombs happen, and none of that ever actually comes to fruition.
Thank you for joining me here today to chat about your book and generally the campaign in Burma. I think we probably went a bit beyond your book there. But the word on the street is that there's a podcast that people could listen to find out more about the war in Burma. Have you heard of that?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thank you, Wesley. That's really kind of you to actually drop it in, because it's your podcast. You don't have to drop me in. But very kind of you. Yeah. So obviously the book Thunder Run is already out and available. But I have started earlier this year with Dr. Robert Lyman. So I'm sure many of your listeners will have read A War of Empires. His brilliant big thesis of the whole campaign, sort of from the strategic level. I'm more of a boots on the ground kind of historian. I like getting in the weeds of the battles and the sort of the thrill of the eyewitness accounts of the conflict. But we have teamed up because of that sort of thing where the strategy versus the boots on the ground. We've started what's called the Forgotten War Podcast, Burma Campaign, World War II. And, we're kind of approaching it chronologically. Series 1, we did the basic overview in 11 episodes and did a 12 Q&A episode. But in 11 episodes, we did war in Burma at a very high level. But we've now rewound back to 1942 in Series 2. And our plan is over the next few years is to do the entirety of the war in Burma, but in great detail. And the first series was entirely narrative driven, so that if people want to know a basic of how this war goes, so that the detail of later stories makes sense, they listen to Series 1 and then they can dip back into wherever we are and it will hopefully make more sense. But we're now doing things like we've got historians. So we've had people like James Holland has come on recently. Various historians of various different aspects have come on for interviews. And also we're doing things like some book reviews of things like memoirs of the people that were there. We did one recently of a soldier that was in the retreat in 1942. We're about to do another one about someone he was 11 years old and basically with his family goes out through the Hukong Valley in the north of Burma, which is sometimes called Death Valley because of how malarial it was. And the sort of the experience of him and his family walking out 1,000 miles on foot to India. A really amazing story of endurance that. So we're doing a lot of things. We're doing the narratives, deep dives, but we're also doing historian interviews and that sort of thing. I can't believe I didn't mention it. First episode of Series 2, we interviewed Bill Slim's grandson as well, Mark Slim, Lord Slim, talking about what it was like having Bill Slim as your grandfather as well. The Uncle Bill, the big man of the campaign.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Thank you for coming to talk to us today. And thank you for writing the book. And I hope it's successful.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Wesley. Thanks so much for having me back again. Cheers.